On July 22, 1934, the United States was shaken by the news of the death of John Dillinger, the country's most wanted criminal. And the very next day, the director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation named a new public enemy number one. He was George Nelson, also known as Babyface. Many books and movies have been written about Dillinger and his gang. The gangster, who became a living embodiment of the chaos that the Great Depression created, attracts the attention of audiences to this day. Researchers meticulously gather information about his every move, and it would seem that the men of the Dillinger gang are well known to anyone interested in the subject. But what if I told you that one character has been neglected, and as a result, his image has been greatly simplified? Most biographers paint George Nelson as a violent and even deranged gangster who's disliked in comparison to Dillinger. Rumor has it that Nelson never regarded others, started gunfights on any occasion, and enjoyed killing his opponents. Is there even a shred of truth to these rumors? That's what we're going to try to find out today. And if you're interested in hearing about the true story of the supposed most violent robber of the Great Depression era, then meet George Babyface Nelson on the other side of the law. Before you continue watching, I'd like to ask for your financial support of the channel. At the link in the description, you can find my store-branded merch with exclusive prints designed by me. If you have the opportunity and you like something, please buy it so you can help the channel to develop. Thank you in advance, and enjoy your viewing. You and I will now be transported back a few years to a time when outlaw George Nelson was a middle-class boy from Chicago and went by the name of Lester Joseph Gillis. Both his parents were immigrants from Belgium. Mary Gillis, maiden name Doge, received a good education that included several foreign languages and immigrated to the United States with money set aside from her teacher's salary. After settling in Chicago, the girl met Joseph Gillis, whom she had known as a child. Joseph came to Chicago 2 years ahead of her and earned a living in the leather business. Known as a skillful and hard worker, a spark flared between Mary and Joseph, and after 3 months of courtship, they were married. Mary left teaching to devote herself to her household and family, and Joseph began working hard, saving money to build a house. By the time the Gillises moved into a 3-story townhouse near Humboldt Park, the family already had 2 daughters. In the bedroom of the new home, Mary gave birth to 2 more girls and 2 boys. It was here that Lester Gillis, the last child, was born on December 6, 1908. The childhood of the future Babyface was spent in a favorable environment. As the youngest, he was pampered and cherished, especially by his older sisters and mother. By his 2nd birthday, his father's financial situation had improved and the family had moved into a larger and more modern home in the neighborhood. Young Lester did not experience any cruelty, but the ability to achieve on his own and the habit of going against the rules came about very quickly. A striking example is his love for animals, which the boy brought home without consulting his parents and justified himself with stories like how the stray dog had saved him from a rabid bulldog. The boy's stubbornness was especially evident when Lester went to school. If the first 3 years in regular school went well, then difficulties came after his transfer to St. Mark's Parochial School. Lester's behavior in class was still exemplary. The problem was that the boy went to them less and less often. The change of school did not remedy the situation. After walking her son to school in the morning, by noon Mary received the news that he had disappeared. His mother found Lester in the park, where he hung out with other boys, brought him home, and disciplined him. The boy would admit his guilt, promise to improve, and the next day everything would repeat. Beatings, forced labor, and other punishments did not bring results either. Lester understood the dissatisfaction of his parents, but could not resist the temptation to escape from the boring lessons. Meanwhile, the number of Lester's buddies was growing, and among them appeared guys from the local gang. And although he was younger, shorter, and better dressed, Lester was able to gain the respect and trust of the tough guys. He quickly gained a reputation as a guy who never ran from a fight. "Nobody messes with Les," was the saying in The Patch, a Chicago neighborhood also known as Smith Park. The local gang consisted of no more than a dozen members, the oldest of which were teenagers. The hooligans never came up with a name for their group, and at first their association was nothing serious, just a group of kids who had nothing to do, causing mischief. However, over time, their antics began to get more serious and go beyond the law. The central figures in the gang were the 2 Tonys, Anthony Capezio and Anthony Accardo, Italian-American teenagers who were 3 years older than Lester. It was the 2 Tonys who introduced the other boys to crime. Their favorite method of making a quick buck was called ringing registers. The essence was that the boys broke into the store and made a commotion, distracting the vendors. At this time, someone, the role was most often given to Lester, slipped behind the counter and took the money out of the cash register. Lester willingly took on risky tasks, and he was the most agile, fast, and fearless guy. Another one of the boy's advantages was a pleasant appearance and good manners, which induced adults. For this reason, it was Lester who was sent to scout the store. Lester skillfully concealed his tricks. His mother was convinced that the worst of his misdeeds was regular ditching from school, and the one time she caught him smoking with friends. On July 4th, 1921, he got into big trouble for the first time. A friend of 12-year-old Lester invited him to hang out at his father's garage. While driving his car, Lester noticed a revolver in the side pocket of the door and decided to have some fun. He and his buddy went out to scare the local kids. Acting like a professional marksman, Lester took aim at a fence post and pulled the trigger. But the prank got out of control. Meeting the post, the bullet shattered into pieces, and one of them hit a local boy in the jaw. Lester was tried in juvenile court and sentenced to several months in a Cook County high school for boys. Here, Lester became a model prisoner, quickly winning the affection of the superintendent and his wife. After spending his allotted time in the school, he returned home with a nearly spotless reputation, marred only by one flight attempt. Lester reunited with his friends in the gang. He remained on good terms with the two Tonys, but they rarely saw each other. The now 15-year-old Italians had moved closer to the densely populated neighborhoods to take on more serious crimes, such as robberies and burglaries. Nevertheless, the influence of the two Tonys on young Lester did not diminish, and he sought to emulate them in everything. Wanting to wear long pants and dine in restaurants like adult gangsters, Lester found a new way to make money. Together with his buddies, he pumped smuggled beer from a bar on Grand Avenue into buckets, which he took to construction sites and sold to workers. But just dressing like a grown-up wasn't enough. Lester, who had been fascinated by cars since he was a little boy, wanted to drive. And since his father strictly forbade the use of the family car, Lester and his friends began to borrow the cars of neighbors, returning them to the place with an empty tank. After one of those joyrides, a neighbor complained about the boy to the police, and Lester again appeared before the juvenile court, which sent him to another high-security school. In December 1924, Lester was suddenly pulled out of the closed institution to attend his father's funeral. In the years prior, Joseph Gillis had become increasingly depressed and drunk because of financial problems resulting from a failed investment in a new restaurant, and perhaps because of his youngest son's reputation. He had previously made 2 suicide attempts, after which he firmly refused medical and psychological help. On Christmas Eve, Joseph returned home drunk. During the night, awakened by the smell of gas, Mary found her husband breathless. The inquest attributed his death to, quote, asphyxiation due to inhalation of lighting gas escaped from a ceiling pipe which he had turned on by his own hand with suicidal intent in a state of despondency. 16-year-old Lester felt guilty over the death of his father and the plight of his widowed mother. In addition, Joseph's tragic end probably played a key role in Lester's subsequent withdrawal from alcohol. Mary had to rent out rooms to tenants to earn extra income to pay the bills. After receiving parole, Lester tried to help her around the house and took a job as a mechanic's assistant. He seemed to have found his place and settled down. However, Lester soon returned to illegal activities. After all, this was the Prohibition era, when gangsters were becoming millionaires and street gangs were rising from the bottom to the top, so Lester's choice was no surprise. On October 1st, 1925, Lester was caught stealing a car, and in June 1926, he received his last parole from a maximum security school. In 6 months, he would turn 18, which meant that for further offenses, Lester would have to answer to the adult court. Lester returned to the company where he worked as a mechanic and was soon promoted to sales floor clerk. The young man changed his dirty overalls for a decent suit and began to earn a higher salary, but his happiness was short-lived. By the end of the year, the car dealership was facing financial problems, forcing the owner to fire Lester. Gillis hastily grabbed the first job that came his way. It turned out to be as an oven assembler in a factory in northwest Chicago. It was dirty and grueling labor, which did not appeal to Lester from the start. The young man began to look for other sources of income and eventually teamed up again with old criminal friends. Together, they engaged in theft and resale of automobile wheels, which Lester paid for on March 2, 1927, when he was captured by the police. Through the efforts of his mother, who managed to scrape together money for bail, Lester was released, on the condition that he find steady employment and avoid contact with criminals. For the next year and a half, Lester served as a personal driver, delivery driver, and mechanic in the transportation department, which was the longest time he had ever spent in a legal job. His trouble with the law during this period came only from trivial speeding infractions. Prosecutors often tried to dock Lester, but only 3 of his fines during the time between 1927 and 28 reached traffic court. Gillis was afraid that if he lost his license, he might lose his job, so he looked everywhere for an excuse. He soon discovered that many police officers would easily tear up a ticket for a $5 or $10 bribe. According to Lester's mother, some of the local cops didn't even look for an opportunity to shake him down. Officers could simply show up at Gillis's workplace and threaten to take him away for questioning or identification in connection with a recent crime in the neighborhood. Realizing that suspicion of something like that could cost him his job, Lester paid them off. Perhaps it was this regular extortion that provoked him to return to crime, or perhaps it was a convenient excuse. In any case, as soon as Lester's probation ended in March 1928, the guy immediately resumed contact with his buddies from the criminal world. The subsequent period in Lester's life created a lot of rumors. It was said that he killed several people, robbed several banks, worked for Al Capone, and made a lot of money as an independent bootlegger. Of these rumors, only the last one had a grain of truth to it. In general, such rumors spread because some of Lester's old friends had ties to the Italian mafia, which means that Gillis had the opportunity to become a partner of the Chicago outfit. However, Lester did not take that chance. The reason for this, most likely, was that Gillis did not want to get involved with the mafia and be a subordinate to anyone. In fact, Lester's earnings at the time were more modest than described in the stories, and they accumulated by transporting shipments of contraband alcohol and car thefts. At the time, Lester Gillis experienced some changes in his personal life. In 1928, he fell in love with a 15-year-old Helen Warszanak, the daughter of German immigrants of Polish descent. She reciprocated, and after a brief affair, the girl became pregnant. Without seeking the counsel of relatives, the couple fled to India to get married. In the marriage certificate, Lester indicated his profession as chauffeur and recorded his age as 21 years old instead of 19. His bride, who was 3 months pregnant, added 5 years to her age. Back in Chicago, the newlyweds moved into Lester's mother's house until it became apparent that the home would have to be sold due to mounting debts. Mary moved in with her daughter Amy, and Lester and Helen settled into his second sister Julie's apartment. Lester voluntarily began to pay part of the rent, buy groceries, as well as clothes and toys for the future child, while his wife and relatives preferred not to directly ask where he got the money for all of this. On April 27, 1929, Helen gave birth to a son, who was named Ronald Vincent Gillis. 2 months later, Lester found work at a gas station and contacted an old friend, Howard Davis, who ran an automobile dealer and garage from where he delivered cars to his customers. Since Lester spent a lot of time at Howard's place and his name didn't appear on official records, it wasn't hard to guess that Gillis's work was outside the law. But despite all this, the Gillises were suffering from a severe lack of money, which caused even more unrest when Helen announced her second pregnancy. At about this time, Lester met Harry Lewis Powell and Stanton John Randall. The former was the son of a Maryland rabbi and a newcomer to crime. The latter was twice Lester's age and served 12 years in prison for murder. This motley crew had one thing in common: a desire to improve their financial situation. It just so happened that Powell had once worked in a jewelry store and was well versed in precious stones and metals, and Lester had several acquaintances who were fences. The trio decided that stealing jewelry could bring them good money, and on January 6, 1930, they made their first raid. Their target was the mansion of millionaire Charles Richter. Here is how the tenants described the incident. At 7 o'clock in the evening, when Charles and his wife were spending time with their children, their maid heard the doorbell ring. On the doorstep were 2 men, one of whom told her to call the owner. When Richter himself opened the door a few minutes later, one of the strangers held a gun to his stomach and demanded that their crew be let into the house. The host obeyed, and 5 men entered the foyer. While the armed man guarded the homeowner and the maid, his companions scattered around the first floor. The lady of the house, who descended at the noise, obediently took the 3 robbers to the room where she kept her jewelry, making the criminals promise not to touch her kidsi. The thieves took 7 pieces of diamond jewelry, 1 emerald ring, and a platinum watch before leaving the mansion 20 minutes after the intrusion. The loot they took was estimated to be worth about $25,000. 2 weeks later, on January 22nd, the gang struck again, this time at the home of a wealthy attorney, Stuart Templeton. The scenario was almost the same. Toward the evening, the maid heard a knock on the door and saw 3 well-dressed men on the porch. The strangers introduced themselves as interior decorators, and they said they had been called in for an estimate. The unsuspecting maid let them in. A 4th man slipped in with a revolver in his hand. The thieves intimidated the Templeton family and servants, emptied their jewelry box, and fled. 2 months later, on March 31st, the robbers appeared at the mansion of Count Enrique von Buello, who in fact was not a count, but a German gigolo named Hans de Kau, who had cheated an old wealthy widow. Posing as scribes, the thieves entered the house and, using the same tactics as before, took cash and jewelry, which together were valued at about 70 grand. It's not known exactly what role Lester played in these robberies and who the other two of the gang were, but there's no doubt about the involvement of Gillis in these cases. 2 months after the Von Bulow robbery, Lester and his wife moved into an apartment in Cicero, where they introduced themselves to neighbors as George and Helen Nelson. Lester briefly restored his real name to give his newborn daughter the last name Gillis, but afterward reverted to his alias. Life for the now Nelsons began to get better. George, from now on we'll call our protagonist as such, settled his mother in their apartment, as if to make amends for his behavior in the past. They had money, which was not only enough for food and clothing, but also for entertainment. On nights when Nelson wasn't moonlighting at the gas station, he and Helen could go to expensive clubs, movies, and bars. Nelson paid generously for drinks for his wife and friends, although he himself still abstained from alcohol. During the day, George could devote himself to hobbies. In the summer and fall of 1930, he participated in several races in a car built specially for him. Each time Nelson managed to show himself as a dashing racer and a decent finish, but he never took the prize. As time went on, money from the robberies began to run out. Nelson still had most of Von Bulow's jewelry, but it was too recognizable for resale, and the part that was sold to fence dealers made very little profit. When Nelson, Randall, and Powell got together again in September 1930, they decided it was best to abandon the jewelry scheme and switch to stealing cash. The criminals targeted the Itasca Bank, located in DuPage County, northwest of the Chicago metropolitan area. On the morning of October 3rd, Powell and Nelson entered the building when the business had just opened. The bank's president was running late, and there were only 2 employees in the main room, a teller and her assistant. Without ceremony, the robbers threatened the employees with guns and ordered them to lie down, and while Nelson stood over them, Powell cleaned out the cash drawers. The thieves then forced the assistant cashier to take them to the vault and collected the money from there. Finished, they ordered the employees to give them 10 minutes to get out of town, left the building, and jumped into an automobile with Randall waiting behind the wheel. Counting the loot, the trio found that they had collected $4,678, 4 times the average annual income at the time. Nelson celebrated by buying himself a new sedan 8 days after the robbery. Emboldened by their success, the boys didn't wait long, and a month later, on November 7th, they showed up in Plainfield, Illinois. The local bank they had their eye on had already experienced 2 robberies in the past year, and the bank president had taken measures to prevent new raids. In particular, the wall behind the teller's desk had been made bulletproof, so that when Nelson and Randall started waving their pistols, a bullet fired by Nelson ricocheted off and almost hit him. In addition, the bank president himself appeared to keep a gun behind the counter that he knew how to use. Realizing that they might be shot at, the robbers fled. But embittered by their failure, they robbed a bank 2 weeks later in the suburb of Hillside, a few miles west of Cicero. On the morning of November 22nd, the trio entered the bank in full force and took $4,155 from there without trouble. 6 weeks afterward, state investigators first heard of a young, ambitious bandit named George Nelson. Informants described him as a short guy with childlike facial features, which matched the testimony of one witness to the robbery. Gradually, investigators found out the names and addresses of the trio, and on February 13, 1931, alternately captured Randall, Powell, and Nelson. In a press interview, a police captain called the arrest one of the most important in Chicago history, and gave Nelson the nickname Babyface, by which he would continue to appear in the media. The trio of robbers were charged with robbing a bank in Hillside and the Von Bulow mansion. Powell was the first to reveal himself and his companions, and he received only a year's probation for his cooperation. After many attempts to deny involvement, Randall also pleaded guilty and was sentenced to a term of 1 to 10 years. Nelson proved to be the most stubborn, and despite the entreaties of his attorney, insisted on his innocence. On July 9, 1931, the court gave George Nelson a sentence of 1 year to life in the state penitentiary in Joliet. Before he left, Nelson hugged his family and told his mother that there was no point to life right then. In prison, Nelson returned to the role of model prisoner he had played as a teenager in the pen, though his new life was driving him more and more into ennui and hopelessness. In January, he was brought to trial for a bank robbery in Itasca, and in February, he was found guilty. He received another year in prison and realized that this was clearly not the end of things. His family followed him and his guard to Wheaton Railroad Station, from where they were to leave for prison after his conviction. There seemed to be no more hope for the handcuffed Nelson, but no. When they reached Joliet Station, Nelson and his guard got into a cab. As the gates of the prison loomed ahead, the prisoner suddenly moved toward the guard and poked him in the rib with the muzzle of a pistol. The guard, who had not expected such a turn, obediently complied with Nelson's instructions and removed his handcuffs. The perpetrator then forced the driver to take him to a cemetery near the Summit community and took $10 from the guard, refusing an offer to take all his money. The police were ultimately unable to capture the fugitive or find out where he got the gun from. Most likely, Nelson got the gun from a friend and/or family member on his way to jail. But who was in on it with him? The criminal himself, while talking about the episode of his life, did not give a specific name and said that the gun was planted on him by an angel. Among the suspects were his wife Helen, his sister Leona, and several old buddies. Nelson's whereabouts for the next 2 weeks also remain a mystery. Apparently, he spent most of his time hiding out in the Chicago home of one Frank Paskey, a distant relative of Nelson's former cellmate. There was also an unconfirmed report that Nelson had traveled to Iowa in the company of an old friend and had pulled off several small robberies there. Then Nelson returned to Chicago and met up with gangster friends who promised to make sure Nelson was welcomed by their colleagues on the West Coast. In late April, Helen received word that her spouse, who had escaped incarceration, was waiting for her. Leaving her young daughter in the care of her grandmother and aunts, Helen packed a suitcase and jumped into Nelson's buddy's car with her son. Nelson himself, who is now officially Jimmy Burnett from Sausalito, was waiting for them in a black Ford a few miles outside Chicago. After a touching reunion, the young couple and their son arrived on the Pacific coast. Nelson's first stop was Reno, and his first act in that city was to call Bill Graham. He controlled the local casino and was rumored to receive a percentage of the city's other gambling establishments. Upon meeting in person, Nelson immediately took a liking to Graham, who had previously heard about him from mutual acquaintances, and he took him under his wing, so to speak. Through Graham, Nelson got acquainted with some local crooks, and one of them offered to participate in transporting illegal alcohol. Nelson agreed, and together with Helen and his son, moved to Sausalito, California, where there was a base of smugglers. For 6 months, he participated in operations to transport illegal booze, earning $300 a week. Details about this period of his life are quite scarce, but it is known that during this time, Helen became very ill, and Nelson used his new connections to put her in a hospital under another name. In order to support his wife, Nelson was on duty at her bedside almost around the clock and arranged for the arrival of their daughter, Darlene. 6 months later, in the latest edition of the Sausalito paper, residents read an article about escaped convict Lester Gillis, nicknamed George Babyface Nelson. In the attached photograph, it was easy to recognize the recently arrived Jimmy Burnett with his wife and kids. So, with Bill Graham's encouragement, Nelson and his family hurriedly returned to Reno. There, Nelson became Graham's chauffeur and bodyguard while performing other tasks, reporting on the situation in the city, checking gambling establishments, and getting acquainted with new figures from the criminal community who had arrived in Reno. Nelson was terribly concerned about the possibility of going behind bars again, and he took steps to conceal his identity. First, he grew a mustache, and second, for several weeks, he persistently rubbed a powerful solution into his fingertips to alter his fingertips. From this procedure, Nelson's hands grew covered with blisters and terrible pain, which made him irritable and sullen. In the spring of 1932, Nelson was tired of working for a boss, and he said goodbye to Graham before moving to Long Beach. Then he went to St. Paul, Minnesota for a while. This place gained a reputation as a haven for crooks, where criminals of all stripes gathered and who police often cooperated with. Nelson's plan was to assemble a gang of talented thieves, which he could lead to raid banks. The connections he had gained in Reno gave him a chance to make it happen. After several days of searching and negotiating, Nelson came upon a seasoned bank robber named Edward William Binns, who agreed to be something of a mentor to him. Binns pointed Nelson to a promising target, a bank in a small town in Michigan called Grand Haven, and he gave him advice on recruiting people for the team. In the days leading up to the operation, Nelson first encountered the men who would later make his fame skyrocket, John Dillinger's gang, which, in addition to himself, included Homer Van Meter, Harry Copeland, Sam Goldstein, and Clarence Moeller. After Binns introduced them to each other, the company socialized at a bar, and then Nelson and the gang members went their separate ways. Binns thought out the robbery to the last detail. Together with an assistant, he studied the structure of the bank and collected information about the employees. Then Nelson and his 3 accomplices trained for several days, learning the subtleties of handling weapons. Although Binns had originally planned to stay out of it, Nelson and his companions persuaded the old-timer to take part in the operation. A little time later, they were joined by Homer Van Meter, a member of Dillinger's gang. Rumor has it that he and Nelson really didn't like each other. but in fact, their differences began much later. At their first meeting, the guys quickly became friends, so Nelson invited Van Meter to visit his cottage and then dragged him into the upcoming robbery. Eventually, as many as 8 men got involved. On August 18th, the robbers drove up to the bank, confident that their plan was flawless. But as is often the case in life, almost immediately things went wrong. Binns was supposed to go to the office of the head teller and lead him into the lobby at gunpoint, but he found the teller talking on the phone, and instead of executing his plan, he waited for him to finish. His delay caused Nelson and the others to stall, leading one of the employees to suspect something amiss. Next, Binns led the head cashier out of the office, while the others forced employees and customers to the floor. One of the employees, however, managed to press the silent alarm, and police officers rushed to the call, which was not part of the perpetrator's calculations either. In addition, the alarm went off in the furniture store next door, and the owner and his cousin ran out. As the robbers entered the store owner readied his gun and shot the driver of the car, who he believed was one of the gang members. The driver drove away, and the 5 thieves inside the bank realized they had to retreat immediately. Covered by 8 hostages, they left the building. The police arrived and confusion broke out. Both sides opened fire, causing mostly civilians to suffer. One of the robbers was seriously wounded and injured his leg, causing him to be captured and cut off from the others. His companions managed to retreat to a nearby street and caught a passing car. After ejecting the woman driver and passengers, among whom were 4 children, the bandits took their seats and drove away. 5 miles out of town, the car ran out of gas, and the outlaws threatened to take a vehicle that was parked near a farm. Toward evening, a tire blew out on that vehicle, and Nelson and his companions stole a Ford from a group of teenagers. When the criminals were satisfied that they had escaped, they counted their winnings, which amounted to about $2,500 in cash, $6,000 in banknotes, and $7,000 in bonds. It wasn't a bad sum, but the robbers had expected to get $50,000, so everyone was a little disappointed. On August 30th, 1933, Nelson temporarily left his comrades and traveled with his family to Chicago to visit relatives and his underworld friends. Returning in September, he reunited with his St. Paul buddies to participate in a robbery of a large and supposedly impregnable bank in Brainerd, Minnesota. This time, Nelson no longer enlisted in the help of Binns, deciding that everything he could learn from the old gangster had been learned. The case involved 6 men and began at 6 o'clock in the morning of October 23rd. This time the robbers did not wait for the bank to open, but simply stood guard at the door and waited for the first employee. Having intimidated the bank's caretaker, they calmly went inside and promptly met the arriving employees and told them what to do. Those who could not be useful in opening the vault were simply taken to a back room, and by 9:30, the room was already filled with 14 people. Eventually, one of the tellers volunteered to open the vault for the robbers, and one of Nelson's accomplices carried out bags of cash. On the way out, the criminals opened fire on nearby buildings for some reason. The police later decided that the robbers did this to be remembered by the locals, although why this was necessary is not quite clear. After their performance, the guys jumped into a car and fled, taking with them $32 grand. After celebrating their success, Nelson and his family again returned briefly to Chicago, where Nelson met up with his buddy from Dillinger's gang, Van Meter. By the fall of 1933, it must be said, their 7-member crew had made quite a stir in the media, with the most publicized figure being John Dillinger, who, contrary to public opinion, was not the actual leader. Since his last encounter with Nelson, Dillinger had managed to commit at least 4 robberies, get caught by Ohio police, and escape from prison with the help of his comrades. On the very day that Nelson was involved with a Brainerd bank raid, Dillinger's crew committed a heist in Greencastle, Indiana, before hiding out in Chicago. Van Meter told Nelson that their boys were trying to make connections with the local crime scene without much success and needed help. Shortly after this conversation, Nelson met with the gang members and provided them with a list of reliable car dealers and weapons suppliers, as well as places where criminals could congregate without attracting too much attention. During the meeting, Nelson grew even closer to most of Dillinger's crew, but the thought of joining them had not yet occurred to him. Nelson returned to his St. Paul gang and began to discuss their next gig, but then police came across one of the men involved in the Brainerd robbery. Sensing that their situation had become too dangerous, Nelson announced to his associates that it was time to move. On November 13th, his crew left town. After spending a few days in Chicago, they moved to San Antonio, where they spent some more time partying. Once out of the city, the gang members split up. Nelson, Helen, and their son headed west and on December 16th arrived in Reno, where they already knew how things worked. Here they stayed a little longer so that Helen could regain her health in the hospital, and during this break, Nelson began to consider his next steps. Rumors had reached him of the capture of one of his associates and the possible death of another. It became clear now that his criminal career would have to continue with other people. The other news that hit the papers was the arrest of John Dillinger in Tucson, Arizona at the end of January. After Helen's discharge, the Nelsons spent 2 weeks at a rented cottage on the bayou, where George's mother and sister visited them. Then, in February, they returned to St. Paul. At this point, John Dillinger was already doing time in the Lake County Jail at Crown Point, Indiana. He was facing trial for the murder of a patrolman during a bank robbery in East Chicago, Indiana, but the criminal wasn't going to wait for it. At first, Dillinger made a crazy escape plan, according to which his buddies were supposed to blow up part of the building, but the assistants recognized the idea was flawed. However, the escape did take place, just without dynamite. On March 3, 1934, as he threatened with a pistol, Dillinger directed the prison staff he encountered on their way to the cells and disarmed them. Then, with the help of his accomplices, got out of the building and drove away in a Ford with the hostages. There are different rumors about how Dillinger got the gun, and if you're interested in them, or interested in the detailed story of John, we have a 2-hour video about him on our channel. I recommend you give it a watch. On who facilitated the prisoner's escape, of course, there are several different opinions as well. And according to one version, Nelson was among Dillinger's liberators. There's the possibility that Dillinger's assistant attorney, Arthur O'Leary, had connections with guys in the East Chicago underworld, and those guys had connections at the prison in Crown Point. For a price, these guys could make the guards look the other way in a friendly manner, while someone was sneaking a gun into Dillinger's cell. The problem was they had to raise $25,000 to make the deal. $5,000 was paid by Dillinger's lawyer Peake, to whom the criminal promised to pay 10 times that amount later. Dillinger's buddy Hamilton added the funds he had and enlisted the help of Van Meter and Nelson, and they contributed the largest sums. In return, they were given their word that Dillinger would repay the debt out of his proceeds from their next heist together. At least that was the way things might have gone. And if the supposition that Nelson participated in this escape is true, it becomes very clear why he subsequently joined Dillinger's gang. But before we get to the story of the robberies and the new team, we must discuss a case in which Nelson was likely to be involved, and which occurred on the same day that Dillinger reached Minnesota. At issue is the murder of Theodore "Ted" Kidder, which occurred in St. Louis Park, Minnesota. Late that evening, Ted was driving home with his wife and mother-in-law after a party at a friend's house, and at one point they were followed by a Hudson, whose driver was clearly trying to pull Ted to the side of the road. When Ted noticed this, he tried to change his route, but the pursuer wouldn't let up. Ted pulled up outside a restaurant to get help, but halfway to the building, he was stopped by a man in a long coat who Ted's wife and mother-in-law described as looking like a gangster. Ted's wife also noticed that there were 4 men in the Hudson parked behind them, and that the man behind the wheel looked very young. The man in the coat took a few steps away from Ted, drew his gun, and fired 3 quick shots before telling the terrified women to shut up and jump into the seat of the Hudson. Moments later, the car sped away, but one witness was able to note that it had a California license plate. The ambulance arrived too late. Severely wounded in the chest and abdomen, Kidder died within minutes. The murder was never officially solved, but by the end of 1934, police were certain that Babyface had committed the crime. The conclusion was based on the fact that the Hudson mentioned was identified as the same one Nelson had bought in San Francisco about 6 weeks before the murder. This version of events was later confirmed by Nelson's former buddy Fatso Negri. He got the dates wrong though, and the location of the incident. And ultimately, he gave this information 7 years after the first interrogation, where he could say almost nothing. Besides the fact that Negri's reports on Nelson's gang are recognized as an unreliable source, the account of the St. Louis Park murder presents the event as a spontaneous and even insane decision. Allegedly, Nelson and his buddies accidentally cut off Kidder's car, or Kidder cut off their Hudson. Opinions differ here, and it erupted into a conflict. Arguments against this version are as follows. First, according to eyewitnesses, the shooter called Kidder's name, so they already knew each other. Second, further investigation revealed that the murdered man often played golf with the well-known figures of the criminal world, sold local gangsters weapons, and may have been an informant. Finally, third, if based on the testimony of Ted's wife, then Nelson most likely was not the shooter, but the driver. All in all, the case is rather convoluted, although police and FBI agents have tried to simplify it and present it as just another prank by a man who would one day be labeled the new public enemy #1. Whether Nelson was a murderer, an accomplice, or unwitting co-conspirator, Kidder's death clearly had him worried, as he announced to his wife in the early morning hours of March 5th that they were moving again. Moving into an apartment 10 blocks from their previous home, Nelson left his family to go on his first job for the Dillinger team. It was March 6, 1934, By 10 a.m., a large dark green Packard with a Kansas license plate rolled up to a bank in Sioux Falls, South Dakota's largest city. 5 men with hats pulled down over their eyes and long coats with collars turned up stepped out of the car. Nelson entered the bank first, followed by Eddie Green. 24 employees and a few customers were already gathered inside. Taking out a machine gun hidden under their clothes, the robbers began to walk around the room and put anyone who caught their eye onto the floor. A few moments later, Dillinger and Van Meter burst into the room. For some time, there was confusion in the bank because of the uncoordinated action of the robbers. At one side, Nelson, like a graduate of the Benz School, ordered everyone to lie down on the floor, while at the opposite wall, Green made people stand with their hands up facing the lobby. Dillinger and Van Meter didn't want frightened faces staring back at them, so they told employees and customers to step back and turn toward the wall. When along with the others, the men that Nelson had earlier laid on the floor stood up and turned away, the perpetrator became frantic as most of the north wall was occupied by windows. Nelson immediately shouted to them to shift and put their hands down. To make a long story short, for the first few minutes, employees and customers moved around the bank, not knowing what they were supposed to do. Then, when the bandits were satisfied with their captives' dispositions, Nelson and Van Meter stayed with them, while Green and Dillinger took the bank president with them toward the vault. The situation outside was controlled by 2 other members of the gang. Tommy Carroll disarmed and led the first arriving policeman into the bank with the rest of the prisoners, and then scattered the crowd of curious spectators with gunshots. A 6th bandit, either Hamilton or another unarmed gangster, stood beside the getaway car and controlled traffic on the road, shooting at those who slowed or stopped. Gradually, more police cars began to pull up to the building. Carroll continued to fire on them, and for a time he was joined by Nelson, who managed to wound one officer. As a result, 4 policemen were taken hostage, and they were among those who the bandits used as human shields as they retreated. When Dillinger took the money from the vault, the robbers left the building and, still firing back, proceeded to their Packard accompanied by 20 prisoners. After selecting 6 of the hostages, the bandits ordered them to stand on the steps of the car and drove away. After driving some distance, the outlaws released 2 of them and placed the 4 remaining women in the passenger compartment of their laps. When Sioux Falls was behind them, the captives were released, and the gang pursued by the police while they drove down country roads toward Minnesota. Every time a police car was near, one of the robbers would start firing at it. As a result of the intense chase, in which law enforcement even got airplanes involved, the fugitives changed about 3 vehicles and successfully escaped. Arriving in Minneapolis, the bandits split the loot, which amounted to $8,000 each. Following a brief respite, the robbers began to prepare for their next operation in the state of Iowa. The First National Bank of Mason City, which they had chosen, reportedly held about $250,000, so they set about the business with great enthusiasm. This time the team consisted of 7 men, and the participants in the previous robbery were joined by a bandit whose identity was never certified. Perhaps his name was Gannon or John Paul Chase. On March 13th around 2 p.m., the robbers drove up to the bank in a Buick with Indiana license plates. Carroll stayed guard in the car, Nelson and Van Meter took up posts near the building, and the others went into the bank. The robbers followed a tried-and-true pattern of causing commotion, forcing everyone to the floor and looking for an employee to open the vault for them. Only this time, the usual scenario didn't work. Fisher, the assistant cashier the gang had been hoping for, had successfully locked himself inside and was impossible to get to. Even more serious was the watchtower, which no one had paid attention to at first. The guard sitting there had managed to fire a shell, which caused gas to slowly spread through the hall. Meanwhile, a crowd of onlookers began to gather in front of the bank. Someone had started a rumor that a movie about robbers was being filmed in the building, and people were stopping in hopes of meeting movie stars. Van Meter fired a few shots into the air, causing onlookers to scatter in panic. Not wanting to fall behind his buddy, Nelson opened fire on an approaching car, causing the driver to immediately turn the other way. Babyface also shot a nearby secretary in the leg, who he mistook for a cop. With all this, the robbery grew increasingly out of control. When Dillinger and his buddies got desperate to get into the vault and walked out with what little money they could get, they joined a shootout with the police and supporting civilians. The bandits were then able to retreat to their Buick and after a time break away from the chase. The result of this haste was, to put it mildly, unimpressive. Instead of the expected $240,000, the gang took only $52,000. In addition, Dillinger and Hamilton were injured, although not too seriously. And if we talk specifically about Nelson, this event greatly damaged his reputation. The hostages who left with Dillinger's gang remembered Babyface as the most aggressive of the robbers because he more often than the others resorted to threats and obscenities. Their testimony would later contribute to Nelson being described as more violent and aggressive than Dillinger. After dividing the money they received, the criminals decided to take a break until April so that Dillinger's and Hamilton's wounds could heal. Taking advantage of the pause, Nelson, along with his wife, son, and mother, went to visit relatives in the West. For a time, they made a stop in Reno, where Nelson may have gotten involved in the murder of banker Roy Frisch, who might have been a rival of his former bosses. The details of the case are unknown. Just one late evening, the 45-year-old banker disappeared without a trace on his way home, and by a strange coincidence early the next morning, Nelson left Reno. Nelson's involvement in the murder was learned through the accounts of his former buddies, with each presenting a different version. According to some, Nelson shot Frisch himself, and according to others, he only delivered Frisch to clients and then hid the body. Which of these is true is unknown at this time. After Reno, Nelson's family stayed for a while at his sister's home in Bremerton. In early April, leaving their son and his mother behind, Nelson and Helen headed back to Minneapolis. The gang was supposed to commit another robbery in Iowa on the 4th, but plans fell apart after FBI agents got on the trail of Dillinger and his girlfriend Billy. There was a shootout between the bandit and the protectors of order, during which Dillinger again managed to escape. But his associate Eddie Green was not so lucky. A little later, the agents found him, and while trying to shoot back, the criminal received a fatal wound to the head and died in the hospital. So on April 4th, Dillinger did not go to rob another bank, but left the clinic of Dr. May, who healed his wounds, and together with Billy went to visit relatives in Indiana before rushing to Chicago. That's where the rest of the gang, including Nelson, began to show up. The very next day after arriving in the city, Dillinger was in for an unpleasant surprise. His girlfriend was captured and taken into custody. It became obvious that Chicago was not the safest place for the gang, and the criminals decided to find refuge in a quieter region. The choice fell on a hotel in the woods of Wisconsin, located 30 miles south of Mercer. Emil Winotka, the hotel owner, quickly guessed Dillinger's identity but promised not to turn in his crew, provided they behaved peacefully. However, in the end, under the influence of his wife and fear due to the unstable antics of Van Meter and Nelson, Winotka did not keep his word and through relatives passed the message to FBI agents. That same evening, April 22nd, agents drove up to the building and prepared to do battle with the criminals. This time their plan failed again. Mistaking ordinary hotel guests for the bandits, the agents accidentally killed one of them and wounded another. Taking advantage of the turmoil and the fact that the law officers did not know the area, Dillinger and the rest of the gang, who were in the main building, managed to slip out and escape, although not without a gunfight. Nelson, however, was in a different situation. When the agents began the operation, Nelson was not with his associates and wife for some reason. Realizing what was going on, Babyface immediately returned fire and then managed to enter the main building unnoticed. Finding neither his comrades nor Helen inside, Nelson assumed that they had already fled. This was only partially true. Only the men had escaped, and their girlfriends, including Nelson's wife, had been captured by the agents. The unsuspecting Babyface slipped back out. Bypassing the agents, the outlaw ran north, while almost all of the rest of the gang moved in the opposite direction. Dillinger and those with him ran to a roadside hotel and got the owner of one of the cars parked nearby to drive them. Tommy Carroll, who had also separated from the others, ran through the woods on the other side and stole a Packard sedan parked outside a house. Nelson took the longest time on foot. In about an hour and a half, he traveled over a mile and reached a lake where he noticed a cottage on the shore. Entering the house with a pistol, Nelson got the owner and his wife, Mr. and Mrs. Lang, to get into the car with him and drive him south. They soon stopped at the home of the Kerner family, with whom the Langs were acquainted, and went inside. By sheer coincidence, Emil Winotka and two of his waiters arrived there shortly afterward to warm up. Having chosen Winotka and Kerner as his hostages, Nelson sent them to a car parked outside the house. Just then, FBI agents, probably tipped by Flora Robbins, a woman who lived with the Kerners, drove up to the mansion. Nelson and the four agents began firing at each other, and the former was victorious. Two of his opponents were seriously wounded, and one of them died before an ambulance arrived. Nelson then jumped into another man's car and drove several miles before the vehicle got stuck in mud. After traveling some more distance on foot, Nelson was fortunate enough to come upon the Catfish family's secluded cabin, where he was given clothes and a place to sleep. For 3 days, Nelson recuperated and waited for the hype surrounding a shootout with the agents to die down. In the meantime, Dillinger and his buddies made their way to Chicago in a vain attempt to help the wounded Hamilton. Helen and the other 2 women were put in jail by court order. Nelson's wife had the hardest time. She was kept in isolation and constantly interrogated, threatened with imprisonment and separation from their children. Helen cried a lot but did not give up and stubbornly insisted on her innocence. When Nelson reached Illinois, he learned of his wife's arrest and somehow contacted Dillinger. By this time, their comrade Hamilton was dying of gangrene and could not be helped. Nelson was one of 3, besides Dillinger and Van Meter, to attend the outlaw's secret funeral. After this sad event, Nelson moved Dillinger and Van Meter to Lake County, Indiana, where they still had reliable allies. Babyface then ventured back to Chicago and afterward retreated to the village of Wakanda. On May 25th, the trial of the Dillinger gang girls, Helen, Mickey, and Jean, was held. After listening to their attorney, all 3 pleaded guilty to hiding the gangsters, and the judge gave them each 1 year's probation. A few days later, Nelson and his wife were reunited and traveled with Carol and Jean to Wisconsin for a short time. The couples then split up, with Carol and Jean going to St. Paul and the Nelsons going to Chicago, where Babyface visited some gang buddies. Dillinger and Van Meter had recently undergone plastic surgery, and Nelson took the opportunity to poke friendly fun at them. Van Meter especially got it, who according to Babyface didn't have to worry about his ruined appearance because he wasn't that good looking in the first place. Meanwhile, Carol and Jean made their way to Iowa, unaware that this journey would be their last. In Waterloo, a gas station attendant spotted a gun on the seat of the car and reported everything to the cops. Upon seeing the officers, Carol drew his weapon and attempted to slip away, but was shot in the back. This event greatly mortified both Dillinger and Van Meter along with Nelson and his wife, who had become very attached to Carol and Jean. It was rumored that Babyface was so enraged that he showed up in Waterloo for revenge, but the man who turned Carol into the police moved in haste, managing to avoid retribution. As Dillinger and Van Meter recovered from surgery, the team began to think about another robbery, and after going through several options, settled on the Merchants National Bank in South Bend, Indiana. On June 31st, the gang of 5 drove up to the building. Nelson and Van Meter took up posts outside, while Dillinger and 2 new team members entered the bank. I think from previous accounts, you've already understood their tactics, and more details would be redundant. Let's just note that the Indiana robbery was particularly noisy and bloody. In addition to the robbers and cops, many civilians intervened in the shootout. As a result, everyone was hurt. One of the policemen was killed, 6 townspeople were seriously injured, Van Meter was wounded in the head, Nelson was also injured, but exactly what happened to him is not entirely clear. He, like the rest of the gang, had come to the robbery wearing body armor, so the bullet that hit him in the right side of his back bounced off, but the impact reverberated throughout Babyface's body, and he suffered from severe headaches for some time afterward. The proceeds of the robbery amounted to less than $30,000. By this time, robbing banks was becoming more difficult and less profitable, and to stay afloat, the bandits needed to come up with something new. Dillinger and his associates decided to switch to robbing trains, which could bring them millions in the long run. Nelson supported the idea, and the team began preparations. On July 23, 1934, the gang might have made their first heist on a train, if not for a ground-shaking event that occurred a day earlier. FBI agents had gotten to John Dillinger and shot him dead. Public enemy number 1 was gone. Excited reporters immediately flooded the Federal Bureau of Investigation's director with questions about who would take the dead man's place. Who would become the country's next most dangerous and wanted thug? John Edgar Hoover answered only the next day, naming George Nelson. The public was quite surprised by this choice. The criminal's name had become widely known only 3 months earlier when he had killed an FBI agent in Wisconsin. There were far more suitable candidates walking around at large responsible for many deaths: Charles Pretty Boy Floyd, the Barker brothers, Alvin Karpis. However, Hoover was not interested in catching the most dangerous thug. After a series of failures and negative criticisms against him, the FBI director finally proved the effectiveness of his agency. But one victory was not enough. To bolster the Bureau's credibility, Hoover had to target someone he was confident in catching. That's one. The second was that Nelson was easy to smear. Unlike Dillinger, Babyface had not achieved full hero status, and he was not talked about much. Therefore, by describing Nelson as an exceptionally vicious, aggressive, and sometimes inadequate criminal, Hoover had no problem turning the public against him. And of course, we should not forget that Babyface single-handedly defeated 4 FBI agents in a shootout, killing one of Hoover's employees and embarrassing the entire agency. Suddenly gaining widespread fame, Nelson hastily left Chicago and moved north with his family and comrades. For the next couple of weeks, their team roamed from one state to another, making brief stops at hotels. Tired of this lifestyle, the gang members decided to hide out in 3 rented cabins on the shores of Walker Lake, a quiet 80 miles from Reno. On the 4th day of their vacation, news reached Nelson and his companions that Van Meter was dead. It meant that Babyface was the last surviving member of the core gang that had formed after Dillinger's escape from prison. But for how long? Perhaps it was this that drove Babyface to hit the road again the very next day. By the end of November, Nelson, who had already become paranoid, had managed to change several more residencies and a couple of cars. During his wanderings, he and his buddies sometimes stayed with acquaintances, and one day, while visiting, Nelson spoke of his fallen associates. All of them, he remarked, referring to Green, Hamilton, Carroll, Dillinger, and Van Meter, had been shot in the back. Afterward, Babyface uttered a phrase that became prophetic. They, i.e. the law officers, won't get me that way. I will meet them face to face and take a few with me. On November 27th, Nelson, his associate Chase, and Helen drove to Wisconsin to trade in their Ford for a Hudson and put Illinois license plates on their car. There, the trio had the misfortune of running into FBI agents, one of whom recognized Babyface's wife and alerted his colleagues. As Nelson headed back to Illinois, Hoover's armed officers followed in his footsteps. 2 of them caught up with Babyface's car on a highway about 35 miles outside Chicago. Nelson decided there was no point in fleeing and instead turned around and allowed Chase to open fire on the agents. A shootout ensued between the passengers of the 2 cars, during which Nelson managed to fall behind. However, the agent's bullets had probably grazed the engine of his Ford, and the car refused to pick up speed. Meanwhile, another car with agents appeared on the horizon. It was 4 o'clock in the afternoon. Chase was firing desperately at his pursuers. Helen was huddled under her chair, and Babyface was trying to move the dying Ford a few more miles. Pulling up near the entrance of Northside Park, Nelson yelled for Helen to run while he himself prepared for a fight. Helen threw herself into the grass near a soccer field and lay on her stomach, while her husband and Chase opened fire on the pursuers. In the first seconds of the shootout, a bullet from one of the agents struck Nelson's left side, piercing his liver and pancreas, and exited through his back. Wrapping his left arm around his side, Nelson retreated to the footplate and traded weapons with Chase to reload his friend's rifle while he fired at the lawmen. When his machine gun was empty, Nelson returned the rifle to Chase, all the while never saying a word about his injury. Babyface then grabbed the rifle from the backseat of the car and, to Chase's amazement, stepped out into the open, motioning at the agents. The scene is forever etched in the memory of eyewitnesses. A reckless gangster marching in a hail of bullets with a shot in his side and a rifle in his hands. Most accounts attribute the act to ferocity and intoxication from bloodlust. Some claim that Nelson went to his death because he knew he would die anyway from the wound in his side. But an old buddy of Nelson's, who knew the baby-faced gangster best, explained the act in his own way. Babyface was still Lester Gillis, a tough guy from the patch who never ran from a fight. Unprepared for such a powerful resistance, the FBI agents backed off. A bleeding Nelson made it to the car, and Helen and Chase took him to the home of a Chicago acquaintance. There, at 7:35 p.m., Babyface died. But the highway shootout took more than just his life. Just as he had intended, Nelson took 2 officers with him, who he had faced in the final skirmish. Those unfortunates were FBI agents Cowley and Hollis, who had participated in taking out Dillinger. Now, 6 Bureau agents had fallen at the hands of gangsters' guns, half of them at the hands of Nelson. Nelson's acquaintance refused to take him to a funeral home as his wife wanted, and Babyface was simply left wrapped in a blanket in a St. Paul cemetery. Hours later, the body was discovered, and the media trumpeted the death of the nation's most dangerous criminal. Nelson's funeral was held on December 1st. About 200 people came to see the body of the famous crook. After a short service, the coffin with the deceased was taken to St. Joseph Cemetery near Chicago. Even before the funeral, FBI agents managed to reach Helen Gillis. Nelson's wife told them about her adventures with her husband without giving the names of his buddies. The court sentenced her to 1 year and 1 day in a Michigan women's prison. After serving her time, the widow returned to her children. George Nelson's name has gone down in U.S. history as the alias of the most dangerous criminal since Dillinger, and the true story of this man has sunk into myths and deliberately spread rumors. Babyface was not an insane maniac, though he was no saint either. Outbursts of aggression, a habit of hitting the road, and cruelty. All these things did show, but alongside, a friendly disposition, responsiveness, and loyalty. Those who knew Nelson as an ordinary guy could not believe what the press said about him. Many attributed the change to the fact that Lester Gillis was influenced by his lifestyle and the people around him. That's probably true. After all, George Nelson, like Dillinger, became the epitome of his time.